Hey Adapters, this is Doug Parsons, and I have been made a partner at Cimpatico Studios, a collective impact company based in San Francisco. We are launching a new type of television experience focused on the lives and work of professionals just like yourself. As I'm sure you can guess, I'm launching the Climate Adaptation Channel, and we're going to be building a close knit community of professional peers. If you'd like to check things out, follow the links below, and I'll send you an invite. In addition to our television shows, we've developed a new kind of enterprise collaboration software that will help you coordinate collective impact initiatives and improve outcomes of common interest. So if you're working on a cross-sector coalition or jointly developing an intervention with several partner organizations and you'd like to learn more about our revolutionary approach to collective impact, please reach out to learn more about beta testing Cimpatico. This show is called Initiating Coverage, and on the show we are joined by global experts to chat about problems that Cimpatico intends to cover extensively in the coming months and year. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Iftekhar Ahmed, a global leader on post-disaster housing systems, to discuss strategies for post-disaster shelter reconstruction and their associated advantages and disadvantages. Ifti is an associate professor and program convener for the UN Co-Certified Master of Disaster Resilience and Sustainable Development, School of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Newcastle, Australia. He teaches on social policy aspects of disaster management and resilience of the built environment, and his research interests span across resilient and sustainable post-disaster housing systems, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and urbanization in the Asia Pacific. Okay, FD, thank you very much for being a guest today. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Doug.
All right, so tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you at? Where are you based?
Well, I work, as you mentioned, at the University of Newcastle. Many people may not know where Newcastle is. Newcastle is about 2 hours north of Sydney in Australia, and it's a very large campus. It's one of the major universities in Australia. I think we are ranked within the top 10 universities here. So this is where I'm based. But more importantly, we run an important master's program on disaster resilience and sustainable development. So which is certified by the United Nations. So our students are from all over the world, and I've been giving leadership to this program, as well as undertaking a variety of research projects around the region, particularly the Asia Pacific region and Pacific countries, as well as in many Asian countries. And not all of them are on post-disaster reconstruction because, like you mentioned, I focus also on disaster resilience and risk reduction. So before we need to do reconstruction, we need to do things that prevent disasters from happening. So I think that's a good preamble to start off with. We could go on.
Well, yeah, I agree. Well, I guess first off, too, we've heard about Australia being in the news so much lately with the wildfires. What's are they out, or is there anything near you?
Hmm. Actually, the region where I'm staying, it has been severely affected. There were bushfires, luckily, not right in our neighborhood, but I could see them from my home, or maybe about 20 minutes drive from here in areas like, I won't mention the places, Singleton, for example, is badly affected, but it's raining now. It has been raining. We had a massive thunderstorm
Hmm.
last week and flooding in many areas. And now, since yesterday, we've been having quite heavy rain, not heavy rain, but continuous rain. And so it looks like if we go this way now, we'll have flooding. So as you see, like if you want to talk about the bushfires, it was preceded by more than 2 year drought, which started in 2017, slow onset, but things were picking up, and it wasn't really considered a serious emergency. Australia is a dry continent; people are accustomed to living with dry spells, but it went on for too long, and it affected businesses and farmers and agriculture very seriously. But and then the bushfire started. So this is where we are at now with the rains. I think we are okay. The bushfires have been like quenched since a month or so, but now we've been having these serious rains. So
Well, here in the United States, it was in the news every day, and obviously, a lot of the wildlife imagery was also shared a lot. You know, see about koalas and such, but it was just it seemed like the Earth was on fire for a few weeks there in regards to Australia with the amount of coverage, and just it must be interesting for you. You're in the business of disasters,
Mhm.
how Australia was handling that, and how were they kind of doing it post. I mean, are you brought in and providing expertise in Australia in that kind of situation, or are you working in other kind of disasters?
And now we are trying to get in. It's a very busy time now with many stakeholders involved. I think at this stage, the first responders are still very active. The police and what we call the state emergency services, the rural fire services, those are the people who are still in action. And many of our students from our program are engaged in jobs working in that area. I had one student who had to almost drop her course in our master's program because she was herself affected, but she was also a bushfire fighter. So you
Wow.
see, so all that. So we are surrounded, but at the moment we are trying to develop proposals how we can look at long-term recovery. As you mentioned, my focus primarily is on reconstruction, recovery, that kind of area. So we have to keep an eye out on how the recovery happens in this region, which has been so badly devastated. When you mentioned wildlife, of course, the koalas is the most traumatic, sensational image, but there are also species which have been completely lost in this bushfire. Smaller ones, which were as it is in a precarious condition, but because of the bushfire, that kind of accelerated the process of extinction. So this has happened as well. Not so well documented. People are still, doing research on that.
Yeah, I'm sure the wildlife biologist is going to spend months just doing surveys to figuring out how much damage there really was. Okay, so I want to talk, I guess, digging into what you're doing, and you've written some books, and I want to ask you about and could maybe explain your book, Sustainable Housing Reconstruction: Designing Resilient Housing After Natural Disasters. I guess it says a lot there in the title, but again, we can maybe elaborate on what the book says and who's using that.
Hmm. Okay, that work was done a few years ago, but it focused on 6 countries. And the way it started was that, if I may go back a little bit, one of the
Please.
massive disasters in recent history was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and that brought a lot of attention to this field. Before, there were disasters scattered around the world, and the United Nations and the organizations were working. But this became everyone's business, partly because it was so sensational, but also the extent of damage and the impact was massive. So, but after that, many of these organizations, they weren't prepared to do to deal with the scale of a disaster. Now we see more and more disasters like that happening, but that kind of started this whole process of reconstruction by organizations, humanitarian agencies, as you may call them, but they made many mistakes. They were unorganized, uncoordinated. Everyone wanted to do their own thing. And so very soon, things came into focus, and the UN cluster system came up, which clustered different sectors: shelter, water and sanitation, gender, etc. But within the shelter sector, they started coordinating the efforts of different humanitarian agencies. So this is the kind of area. So when I started with this book, what had happened is that he said, look, there's so much criticism of what really happened. But surely there must be good examples. Surely there must be examples that we can get good lessons for, and for good practice, basically. So that is the idea. So we started trying to find out case studies where we could actually show a level of effectiveness, a level of success with their challenges, of course. So this is what we did. So we selected 6 countries and 12 case studies. And we also said that these affect both developed and developing countries. The impacts are different, the responses are different, but essentially all countries are affected, particularly in this age of climate change. It's a global phenomenon. So I think we need to look across the world. So that is why we included countries like Australia and the United States as case studies, as well as poorer countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and then so on. And Haiti, of course, that was a very important case for us. Interestingly, just to go on the side a little bit, in Haiti, roughly the number of people who died in the 2010 earthquake, I'm not counting the storms that preceded or after that, was roughly in the range of 200,000.
Mhm.
And the tsunami, the massive tsunami, if you count that also, that was slightly more than that, roughly in the range of maybe 300 or something, around that figure. So you see, that was a massive, massive disaster in a very small, localized area, not so global as, or not regional as the tsunami. So we started looking at these kind of issues, and we wanted to get case studies which say a similar story, but also case studies which have unique narratives for us to garner and present them. So that was
Well,
the book.
I imagine it's kind of morbid thinking about, but you think about Haiti and the amount of people that died in the earthquake, and one of the first things you want to do is rush in there and provide shelter for the obviously the survivors. But then you have this massive mortality, and I wonder there's this sort of you have to get rid of bodies, you have to do these things while you're providing shelter. There's this sort of, I'm sure, chaos that's happening. Do you get involved at that level? Do you see what's sort of happening? How are they trying to provide shelter for people who need it while dealing with obviously a major public health issue?
Yeah, look, I myself haven't been directly engaged in that kind of situation. Most of the work, particularly for this book, is looking at what happened and trying to document it. As academics, we have
Hmm.
limited access because many of these are actually handled by humanitarian agencies, which are very competent in some places. In Haiti, we mentioned dead bodies, of course, but also the rubble from the earthquake that impeded the reconstruction work for a very long time. I know a gentleman from Norway who is actually a specialist on debris removal. And so that's a big issue. You cannot start the recovery because you cannot have access to the sites that are damaged. So that was one area. And very recently, we have embarked on a new project looking at disaster waste management in the Pacific Island countries because that is the problem there also. After there's a disaster, they can't start the recovery. They can't even respond with basic emergency supplies because everything is blocked. And yeah, so that's one area. Definitely Haiti, of course, is a classic example.
Well, let's talk about some of the basics. How do you even define shelter? And as an academic and as sort of these real world applications, what is shelter?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I would really like to discuss this because the word shelter had originally been coined by humanitarian agencies such as the Red Cross or Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. So let's call them Red Cross for now. It's more familiar for most people. Um, so shelter was thought of at that time as something temporary. People have lost their homes; they need a shelter to protect themselves from the elements and kind of function for some time till they're back on their feet. So that is why that term has persisted. And if you look at the broader term of shelter, it's essentially for shelter, food, and water. But of course, it's not shelter. For us, it's housing. We need a house, which is related to infrastructure, a range of services, facilities, transport, etc. So it's a broader gamut. And this is what we again looked at in that book, that these projects that we looked at, they were somewhat successful simply because they took into consideration the wider gamut of things that support a shelter. So the word shelter, it's widely used in different places. In a developing country context, someone with just a tarpaulin over their uh, roof, over their head at night, it's a shelter, and then we may move on to other contexts. So it's a wide variety of things, but it is widely used in the humanitarian context to mean. But increasingly, people are understanding that what we really want is housing, the transition from shelter to permanent housing. So,
Okay, so maybe I'll stump you here, but you've said you cannot fix a door to a tent. What do you mean by that?
yeah. This is a good look. That photograph was taken after the tsunami in one of those countries in Indonesia. This is what agencies were doing, and homeowners were doing that too. This photograph is from homeowners who salvaged that door from their previous house. But what they got was that kind of shelter, which is a very temporary arrangement, just a roof and some pillars where you can take protection from the rain and stuff. But they wanted that door, but they cannot attach it to that
Hmm.
structure, but they just want it. So basically, what this photograph really shows is the need to understand local context, the need to understand local aspirations, their values, that people value these products. For someone from the outside, they say, look, it's a door from a damaged house, forget about it, get a new one. But of course, they can't do it. It's been an investment to get that door in the first place, so they want to hold on to it. But then the issue of technical skills come in, that whether that door is appropriate for the structure they have, there's a process of two-way learning for the organizations through this photograph. That look, what we did is perhaps not appropriate for their situation, and vice versa. For those people on the ground, for them to realize that what we are doing is perhaps not compatible. We need to have a dialogue with these service providers.
Well, I imagine just that quote itself lends itself to a lot of great conversations when you're giving presentations because you're obviously covering a lot of ground and the point you're trying to make.
Mhm. Yeah,
Well, okay, so let me just dig more into this. You've talked about 3 stages for post-disaster shelter. What are these stages?
Okay, this is again very interesting because this is how agencies have approached the problem. They say after disaster, emergency shelter, which means tents and maybe some sort of basic stuff. Tents is the most common one. Let's stick with that. I can talk about tents in great detail because tents are actually not cost effective. They're produced in very industrialized processes. They are shipped, and shipping costs not only embodied energy costs, but also they end up in being very expensive once you transport a thing. So, but anyway, that was that first approach. Then over time, as things get organized, and like you mentioned, the rubble is removed and people, their healthcare needs are attended to and stuff, then you move to something which is transitional. Because it's very hard to build a permanent house. You have to get the right land, you have to consider relocating people and all that. So during the transitional time, uh, they stay in some sort of in between kind of shelter. And then finally, there's a permanent house, which was in the process of being built while we're staying in the transitional shelter. So this is the ideal scenario that agencies have been working with. But what has happened in reality is that those emergency tents, these are assets for people. They've never seen a tent in
Hmm.
many of these countries. So they would hold on to it and to stay with it. And I've recently been to Vanuatu in the Pacific, where they had the cyclone Pam in 2016. I've still seen tents in the community. They've held it, kept it, they're using it. So that's the emergency. With the transitional, the same thing. These are assets, and people won't get rid of them, they just keep them. And in Haiti, because it took, for example, it took so much time to kickstart the reconstruction process, people were staying in these transitional shelters for many, many years. For example, I went there in 2013, 3 years after the earthquake, and there were all these settlements that had grown up. These were like shanty towns,
Hmm.
informal informal settlements built from the transitional shelters. This will never go away. These will be consolidated over time by people. They put in their own money, their cash, their labor, and they will slowly upgrade it. But they will not get rid of it. So that notion that we have the transition shelter, the emergency shelter, people forget about it and move on to the next stage. It never happens in many of these poor countries. And then finally, there's the permanent shelter. That's the dream, but it's very hard to achieve it. It's very hard to have full coverage. Like the amount of people, just to go back to Haiti, it's just a huge number of people who are there. They don't have land tenure or ownership of land. How are you going to build a permanent shelter on land which they don't own? Are you going to give them land for free? If you do that, then the rest of the country is going to land up and say, look, I want a free land also. So it's very, very difficult to do this approach, these 3 stages. So I think organizations have started learning from it. So if I can go back,
Hmm.
first, instead of doing temporary shelter, let's just provide technical support to them, give them tools, maybe just a simple machete to work with and some basic stuff, ropes and things, and they can just kind of fix up, salvage their own thing, and continue on for some time. Forget about the transitional shelter business. Start early recovery ASAP. So that while they are in that kind of salvage conditions before another disaster happens, or even being exposed to the elements like snow in Pakistan after the earthquake. People were in these temporary shelters when the cold season started, and so move on very quickly to some form of early recovery. Salvage materials, use things, use local labor, and try to get people to start rebuilding as soon as possible. And that can be incrementally upgraded and fixed up over time. You don't need to have a nice, brand new spick and span, clean house.
Oh, I wonder how, I guess, integrated is the approach to providing the shelter that when you hear about some big event, in the United States, we'll say, oh, the U.S. Navy is there providing 5,000, makeshift shelters. And they can't all be the same. The U.S. military has particular shelters. The UN must have a kind of a standard that they want to use, but it's never just right. I mean, those are the issues that you're dealing with, right? Because you want to have the strategic approach to it, but it's not that easy to kind of get these things in mass. Has there been progress on, I guess, creating more uniformity in the shelters?
Well, they've been trying to do it, not entirely successfully, but remember I was talking about the UN cluster system. Under the cluster system, the shelter cluster essentially led by the United Nations and IFRC, the Federation of Red Cross Societies. They kind of coordinate the different clusters. So with the shelter cluster, what they would do is that if it would happen, for example, just to give you an idea, that when the tsunami happened in Indonesia, they didn't have the cluster system in that form. But later on, they had a massive earthquake in Yogyakarta in Indonesia. By that time, they had got the act together and had the shelter structure. So whatever they did, all the agencies who wanted to participate, they got together. They said that, look, this is the minimum standard that we'll have. It can't go below this. And so they all agree on this minimum standard. It might be very basic, but it's enough to start. But this is the kind of thing they would all agree. They won't try to outdo each other by trying to, and this is what happens quite a lot, is when the army would try to outdo the UN, and the Navy would say, oh, look, the army is doing it, I'll do better. So this had happened quite a lot in many countries. So to prevent that kind of profiling and unnecessary organizational competition, to kind of organize it. It's very hard to do it, though. It's very hard to do because suddenly a new actor comes in. I've seen houses built by the Saudi government in Indonesia. Now, the Saudi government is connected to them because of a religious affiliation. So they would come in and they would just be allowed to do what they want because they get a lot of money from the Saudi government. So they would build houses which are 3 times bigger than the other ones, and they won't be prepared. And everyone would look at them, look, the Saudi government has given this. Why have you done this to us? Why have you given us such a basic thing? The basic thing has come from this kind of philosophy that people upgrade incrementally over time. If you just build one big house, you cannot help everyone, and so on. But that philosophy is undermined by different actors. But nevertheless, that's the state.
Okay, so who actually manufactures these shelters? I know there's probably different, but are you familiar with? I mean, it must be like, okay, we need 20,000, we need 50,000. Not too many people can actually do that. Who's in the business of building those things?
Well, a lot of people. It's big businesses that
Okay.
have it. It's unfortunate, and I, as an academic, I often get emails from people like, look, you work in this area, we've got this fantastic shelter kit. We'll just do it. But again, we go back to that photograph of the house at the door, that structure at the door. Is it appropriate for the local context? I'll just give you an example. IKEA has this fantastic shelter kit that they've done for refugees in the Middle East, Syria, and so on. Fantastic. And people say, oh, wow, it's beautiful. But then, can they replicate it? Can you give one of those to everyone? IKEA's production is quite expensive. You and I would go to a shop and think twice before you want to buy this IKEA product because they're just branded. So this is what is happening. So there are many players involved. In the United States, for sure, there were many people who just came in, all the different tinkerers who had many ideas, said, look, this is the time. But that is certainly not the way to go, even in a developed world context. You just have to play with what people know, what they would accept, what they would be able to use, and what they would be able to replicate over time so that it becomes systemic instead of extraneous. So, yeah, I think.
Well, I was going to say, does any one group, maybe the UN groups that coordinate this, but where are these shelters stored? And is there sort of like a master map saying, well, North America, we can get access to 100,000, and then Asia, and is there some sort of map of all that?
Well, look, remember the 3 stages I mentioned. With the transitional shelter, I think they've gradually phased out that idea to a large extent because it's very hard to keep a stockpile of materials. They try to use things locally, but then they run into problems. In Indonesia, for example, they needed timber to build those transitional shelters, but the timber there was illegally logged. So they couldn't use it. So what they had to do is to bring in timber from as far as Canada and New Zealand and so on. So that's ridiculous, isn't it? So that's what happened. So I think that idea, but the tents are now with the Red Cross societies or Red Crescent societies, many countries, they have warehouses that they can store it and then they can deploy it but it takes time. In remote areas, it's very hard. But many of these Red Cross, Red Crescent societies in different countries, they are equipped with the basic tents so that you don't have to ship them from Geneva or from the headquarters. So that's if that answers your question, but that's very, very, very short term. And it doesn't happen in countries like Australia. I think people are given money to stay in hotels or with friends. That's the idea, and it's very difficult. We are experiencing now here in New South Wales, many people lost their homes. They don't know where to go. The government has given them one-off grants to stay in hotels and stuff, but how long can you stay in a hotel with your family? Kids have to go to school, you have to go to work, and it just is not. So it's a very difficult problem. That particular time just after disaster till, and if you don't get that right, going to that long-term dream of a permanent house gets further and further away in time.
Well, speaking of your neck of the woods, there were the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009 in Australia. So it's my understanding they created these temporary villages. And you just mentioned Australians might be staying in hotels today, but I bet back in 2009, what were these temporary villages?
Those were actually fantastic. And I'm surprised that they haven't done it. In fact, I've just submitted a paper for a conference saying that why don't we do this? And because that was fantastic, what they had done, and they had a lot of support for those from big organizations like uh, the Gina Reinhardt Foundation, even though she's into coal mining and things. But anyway, but there was a lot of money coming in from philanthropists and agencies to support these people. So they were given these homes, which were what they called just trying to like little granny cotton. I don't know if you're familiar with the word. It's called a granny home.
No.
Okay, in New South Wales, they have a granny home. For example, if I have a large backyard, I could build one of those small ones, like for my granny, and she would stay. But essentially,
Okay.
it's for you can make you can rent it out, you can do things. It's only in New South Wales that they have that kind of idea. So they bought in Victoria to build these granny homes. Just down the road from my home, there is a place which actually produces granny homes. So these are very small houses which have all the basic stuff like utilities and things, but they're very small. Just so this is what they did. They used the granny homes, which is a cost-effective way of housing people over a couple of years or so. And then they had what they called the I'm just trying to remember the Australian term for dongas. I think that's what they call them. These were containers where workers in mines that they stay there temporarily. So they got some of those also shipped in. These was donated by a mining company. So they utilize all these resources, and then in one of the locations, land was given free for a temporary period, and in one of the other locations, that area that has been converted. So they kept those granny cottages, granny homes, and they made them made it into school camp. I actually stayed in one of those when I did my field work there.
Oh,
Just
nice.
cool. Yeah, you can rent them out. You can see, and now there are school camps and all the kids go there for holidays. So they haven't got rid of it. And so they decided to turn it into a business venture. But the other one, the farmer wanted his land back. He says, okay, you've used it for a year and a half, fair enough. Now you need to move your things. So there are different approaches. But what this particular thing did was it helped people stay near their devastated community. They could rebuild their homes not far from there. Their schools were nearby. The kids could start going to school. It helped the community to be cohesive. They tried to stay together, so drifting away. Like if you look at the United States, New Orleans, what had happened is that after Hurricane Katrina, many people left that state or that city simply because it was not possible for them to afford living there anymore. So they went and found friends who could accommodate them in neighboring states where they could find jobs and so on. And they just said it's a large amount. I can't give you the proportion at the moment, but a significant portion of the population, particularly the Black American population, they just left. So this idea of a temporary village prevents people from leaving because they have something to support them. So I can talk more about the temporary village because it's a great case study. And I talked to someone there and he said we had more than a year's supply of toilet paper. And talking about toilet paper, right now we go into the supermarket, we can't find toilet paper anymore. I don't know if you see in the news, people are scared of the coronavirus and they have been stocking up on toilet paper. So all the supermarkets are out.
It's nothing to do with like the actual treatment of the virus, right? They just feel like the toilet paper is something they can't do without, so you better stock up on it, right? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, well, they are taking other things. I think there was a very interesting article in the conversation this morning when they said that the other stuff is also missing. You want to buy hand sanitizers, they are gone, but you can't see them because it's a small part of the shelf. But toilet paper takes up a large part of the supermarket. So you go there, you see the whole shelf empty. It's dramatic, but they are also stocking up on other things, canned food, long life milk, and so on. So people are bunkering down. It's just crazy. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it because I think I'll leave it for people who need it more than I do. So,
Okay, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the different types of shelters. You know, you have emergency shelter, you have this transitional shelter, and then you have permanent shelter. And when you think about that, you don't almost even want to call it permanent shelter because at that stage, it's you've basically tried to build them a permanent home. So the notion of it being just a shelter no longer even applies. Am I kind of reading that right? And so that third stage, like,
is
how
that
do you
how?
how do you get away from the notion that it's no longer a shelter, but it's someone's long-term home?
No, you're absolutely right. And this is something I have been trying to impress on agencies. So you see the name of the book, which you mentioned, it's Sustainable Housing Reconstruction, not Shelter Reconstruction. And in that book, I've argued that it's no longer shelter once they have these homes, these case studies. But it's very hard because this term has coined currency in the humanitarian community, and they understand very well. I think this term was widely popularized by the IFRC through their programs because originally the IFRC used to focus only on provision of temporary shelter. So they didn't do permanent housing till much, much later when they were forced to realize that that's the way to go. Otherwise, people. And you're totally right also, because these homes, we did a study in Indonesia, me and a colleague of mine from the University of Melbourne. We looked at how people extend these houses. So these houses that they got, or permanent shelters that they got, were about 36 square meters. I won't be able to convert that directly into feet. Roughly 360, 400 square feet. Is it? Yeah. So it's very small.
Hmm.
It's a 6 meter by 6 meter block. But these people, what they did was they extended that house by 3 or 4 times. So when you go there, you can't even find the original house. It's covered by all the new things that they built around it, and rightly so, because they actually lived in large extended families. The concept of having a nuclear family, a nuclear home, it's unfamiliar for them. They all live under the same roof. So if you look at that particular context, we looked in Aceh in Indonesia after the tsunami. They before the tsunami, I documented houses which were over 100 square meters in size, so 3 or 4 times bigger. So this is what happens. So I think the notion of a permanent home, it's a bit ambiguous. I think in different contexts it means different things, and of course in the family's life cycle, what is permanent? Everyone makes extensions, changes. The families grow bigger or smaller. As uh, parents, when your kids leave, you don't want that big home. You want to shrink. You want to downsize it.
Hmm.
You want to go somewhere else. You want a granny flat, for that matter. But with other communities, when the extended families start expanding, the son wants to marry and have, but they want to stay close to their parents. So then they would build an extension to the house. So soon the house is much bigger than what it was. So it's a dynamic process. This life cycle of a permanent home is not understood in that sense that it's just not one house. And that's true even in countries like the United States, I think, and in Australia.
Well, I imagine people want to provide immediate housing. You have to give a roof over someone's head immediately after disaster. But I think about how complicated the permanent shelter issue really is, and I'm sure it differs between a developing country and a developed country. But after a while, maybe local planners are concerned. Look, we're clustering all these people in these local shelters. It's affecting the economy because these people are now clustered here, and there must be so many problems that pop up because this artificial way people are kind of living. But at the
Mhm.
same time, other people are more concerned. These people need shelter, and you have to think long term. I'm sure you're seeing that all the time. It's just that
Yeah.
sort of friction as the post disaster date goes farther and farther away. What
Mhm.
problems are you kind of left lingering with?
Yeah. Well, let's look at both of these, in a very general way, the developing and developed country context. If you look at a developed country, what really happens is that even those temporary shelters, people had to get money. No one is going to give them handouts. This government would give them a small grant of some sort, but that's certainly not enough to rebuild a whole new house. So they would have to go back to their insurance, and it's not easy. because many people didn't have insurance to begin with. In the United States, even after Katrina, when I went and did my studies, a large proportion of the Vietnamese American community living there, they didn't have insurance. They didn't even know of the concept of having insurance, and they couldn't afford it. So when they lost their homes, they couldn't rebuild it because who would give them the money? Now, with those people who had insurance, they would get the money for the asset they owned. But then new legislation kicks in. In New Orleans, for example, they had to raise the houses to a certain height because of the flooding after the storm surge. And in Australia, in the bushfire context, they had the new legislation that you have to build according to certain standards where you live. So that extra bit has to be borne by the homeowner. So just imagine you had a disaster, someone dear to you has died, and then you're confronted with wrangling with the insurance companies, and we all know how easy that is.
Right,
And
right,
then,
right.
and then after that, once you've got it, now you see like the insurance company is only giving you the value of the asset that you had, which was not adequate to withstand the impacts, and the new legislations coming to make it better, resilient. So where are you going to get that money? So that's the developed world context. I think people who are wealthy can rebuild quite easily. Others can't, and I have seen people in Australia who bypass that legislation, rebuild by themselves, and they can't get a building approval or the occupancy certificate. They're just staying in that kind of situation for a long time, even in a developed country like Australia, simply because this insurance issue. Now, with the developing world, that's a different story. Now, they would get support and they get houses built by humanitarian agencies because they certainly won't be in a position to rebuild their homes under any circumstance for a very, very long time. So then the problem starts happening. A few thousand people affected. How many homes can you build? So you have to choose the most vulnerable and prioritize them, but how do you do that? And there are all these local politicians who come in and pester you. They want a home for that. So all these problems start happening, and it's very hard to actually build something. And what you mentioned, this kind of ghetto starts happening. You start building these kind of shelters all clustered together, and of course they never live like that. I've seen places where they start joining those homes. A sister got a house, a brother got a house, and they always lived under the same roof. So they spend money and join those two, and so it becomes different. And eventually the whole place starts looking like it was before. And if there's another disaster, they'll be similarly affected.
Okay, so I want to just bring to your attention, we have this chat where some people are watching what we're saying here, and we're getting some commentary and a few questions. And I thought you might appreciate this because you lived in San Francisco for a little while, is that granny homes probably are not that small compared to San Francisco condos. And so that's
Very
from...
expensive also, aren't they?
Right. They would be paying $3 million for one of those granny homes in San Francisco. Ooh. I'm speculating. All right. So what I'd like to do now, I have a few more questions after this, but I'd like to jump to the video that you shared with us. And so just sit back. I'm gonna start playing this, and it'll be about 3-4 minutes. And you obviously know what the video is, and then I'll just have some questions for you afterwards. But let's jump into the video. And you won't see it, but I'll just let you know when we're done.
In the same way, in the family shelter or the house reconstruction program, we have tried to introduce techniques which would ensure risk reduction or make these houses less vulnerable to next floods.
Floods swallow up people's lives and livelihood. With their houses drowned, people take refuge on high roads, dams, or flood shelters. After the floods subside, a lot of them cannot find their houses since they have been washed away. To make sure that the houses of the people whose lives are already difficult do not get washed away by the floods, in various project areas, model houses have been built. Risk reduction aspects of the model houses are cement stabilized earthen plinth, concrete footing, katla, bamboo treatment, and rainwater gutter. Treatment of bamboos is one of the distinguishing features of this project. This protects the bamboo from insect attack and rotting. For the footing of the bamboo posts, the katla is made through local initiative. A soil and cement combination in the ratio of 19:1 was used for capping the plinth of the house. This prevents the plinth from being washed away.
গড়টা খুব সুন্দর হয়েছে বুঝছে গড়টা বন্যা এলেও ভাঙবো না
Rainwater gutter made of split PVC pipes are used to prevent rainwater falling from roof eaves and damaging the lower part of the house. It also provides an alternative supply of arsenic-free water for household use. 16,036 houses were built in 23 districts under the housing project for the flood-stricken people. The houses differ in shape and structure in different areas depending on the quality of soil and easy availability of the materials. In some areas, instead of katla and bamboo, concrete pillars made of rods and cement is used. Again, in some areas, instead of bamboo fences, metal sheet is used. No matter what material is used, it is made sure that the houses are resistant to flooding. Certain criteria is set before nominating the people who are eligible to get the houses. The chairman of Village Development Council plays an important role in this regard.
যাকে ঘরটা দেওয়া আছে তার ঘরটা ধুসে গেছে গা তার ঘর তোলা কোনো সমর্থ নাই সে বিধবা তাকে আমার ঘরটা সমর্থন করিয়া তাকে নির্মাণ করে দেওয়া হইতেছে
আমার স্বামী মারা যাওয়ার পরে আমি অনেক দুঃখ কষ্ট করছি আমি একটা ঘর বেগরও থাকার পাই নাই আমার ভাইয়ের রান্নাঘরত থাকছি থাকার পরে আর বছর একটা সোনার ঘর আসলো ভাঙতে করে বন্যা ভেঙে নিয়ে গেছে সবাই মিলে আমাকে একটা ঘর দিছে আমি কোনোদিনও ভাবিনি যে আমার এত সুন্দর একটা ঘর
Okay, we're back. And yeah, what an interesting video. And obviously the woman at the end there just, I mean, those look like pretty good homes. I mean, it probably didn't take very long to build though.
Yes.
Yeah, well, if you want to add, like, elaborate a bit more, like in the video, like who do you share it with, and what's the purpose and such?
Well, look, this was done way back in 2005 after a massive flood in Bangladesh, and I was the shelter specialist for this project, so I had a direct connection with this. I kind of pulled away from academia for a little bit to work for the United Nations, that United Nations Development Program, UNDP. And so in this particular project, what we tried to do is that we built more than 16,000 houses. And that's a lot of houses. And that didn't cover all the people who were affected by the floods, but we tried to target the most vulnerable and all that through whatever connections we had, despite all kinds of problems. But the issue was that if we built to a higher standard, these homes that you saw, they look very modest, very simple homes. And people weren't happy with them. They wanted to build brick and concrete kind of houses, or brick and corrugated metal sheet kind of houses. And the NGOs who were implementing were very unhappy with this kind of solution. But then we covered more than 16,000. If we built those homes out of brick and that kind of thing that the NGOs wanted to build, we would have built maybe less than a quarter of the number. So that is what, and these houses, interestingly, if you look at my other book, edited book, Community Engagement in Post-Disaster Recovery, also by Routledge as the other one, you see that I went back there after more than a decade after these homes were built, and they had upgraded these homes because this program was also supported with an economic rejuvenation program, with a cash for work program, so people could get economic prosperity. And so when I went there after 10 years, I saw that they'd upgraded those homes in such a way that they were gone almost. They used some of the materials, and the perishable materials like bamboo and all that we survived for quite a long time compared to the regular types. But then eventually they could use the materials and rebuild very large homes. So this was like a springboard for them to move forward. But if we did those big homes, many of those other people would be under trees and just hanging out there basically for years before they could get back on their feet. So that was the approach followed in this project. It was kind of an appropriate solution for that context, which could be replicated and upscaled widely compared to the typical approaches followed by agencies. It was not a permanent home. It was sort of a transitional home, which helped them move, keeping the assets. Not a transitional home that they would scrap very quickly and move on to a permanent home, but which they would upgrade over time according to their context and ability. So,
Well, I bet you learn all sorts of things about local property rights when you deal with different countries. I mean, I'm sure that the laws are much different in every country, and you think about owner-driven reconstruction and the notion of, okay, here's a temporary shelter that becomes a permanent shelter. When it becomes, what's the issue? Who gets to own that? Is it still owned by the people that donated this, or do they just, there's this assumption that who's staying in it, they get certain property rights? And I guess it varies country by country.
It varies country by country, but in many of these countries, they are given the property right. Even going back to Haiti, even those people who didn't have land ownership and tenure, there were negotiations for them to get some sort of documentation to be able to live there. Some countries, they get long-term leases, which is quite good. If they get a 99-year lease, then they're happy to be there for a long time. So it varies in many countries. Some countries won't give them outright ownership. But in this Bangladesh context, it's very different because people own, in rural areas, people own agricultural land, but the homestead land is informal. It won't make sense the way I'm explaining it, but they won't have documentation about the ownership of their homestead land in many places because that's part of the agricultural land, because these were all agricultural and fishing communities. So they live near there. So they own the land on which they had the agriculture, but not the piece of the small little homestead that they would build around the agriculture. So that is why in this particular example with the video clip that he showed, in that example, people just rebuilt where they used to stay before. And there was no question of ownership in that sense.
Okay, I got another question. Here's from Ken. Do you have a sense of how many times per year emergency shelters need to be deployed around the world?
Oh, good question. I won't be able to give you the exact figure, but what I can say for sure, it's getting more and more.
Okay.
It's simply getting more and more, and it's clearly because of climate change impacts. The disasters are getting more and more frequent, massively magnified in terms of impact and magnitude. So it's happening too much. So eventually, agencies realize that they can't keep on doing this kind of stuff. They would have to get people to do things on their own, give them tools, give them shelter kits, so that they can manage on their own. Because this giving out tents, as I mentioned, this is not cost effective. I can give you some rough figures. A family tent, way back in 2015 when I did the studies for that, it cost about $140, just the tent itself. And then transporting it and the cost of it, taking it to remote sites, it's just huge. Now, many of those people, they build their homes for less than that. Or the Bangladesh example, the video clip that you showed, those houses, they were costed at roughly $200. So we're looking at very different figures. Of course, there's the purchasing power parity PPP that kicks in here.
I wonder how climate change is going to affect what you do. You're dealing with these, these situational disasters. But I mean, if you're familiar with it, I don't know if you use maybe a different terminology, but managed retreat from the coast. Like when you think about sea level rise, how are coastal communities going to retreat? And managed retreat is, their way of putting a little bit more thought into it. Normally, when a disaster hits, it just hits. It's out of kind of control. But I think there's probably some lessons to be learned when you're dealing with disasters like you do for managed retreat. And you actually get the luxury of thinking long term. Well, we need coastal Miami to start moving away from the coast. How do we house these people? Where do we encourage them to go? And it's just like sort of doing what you do, but in slow motion. And could they apply things that you, I guess, even teach in the context of managed retreat. Have you had any conversations with academics or such who are dealing with managed retreat?
Look, with this is a very difficult issue, of course. Again, if you look at a developing world context, after the tsunami, for example, in Indonesia and particularly in Sri Lanka, they had what they call a buffer zone policy, that they restricted resettlement because all the settlements on the coast were decimated. And even parts of India and Tamil Nadu, that's what they did. They restricted people from going back and rebuilding homes there by a new policy. So initially, that buffer zone was 100 meters, which is about 1,000 feet or so, roughly, away from the coast. And so all the resettlement programs, the new ones, were built inland, very hard to secure right land, and they had many problems, but not to go there. Uh, but then, after a few years, you see people have gone back to those areas. They have resettled and started building informal because they need to be by the coast because of their livelihoods, fishing particularly. So that was one area. If you look at a developed country, I'm looking at Australia. We live right on the coast. I'm about 20-minute drive from the sea here, and we see all these new estates coming up right on the coast. And there are predictions that with Newcastle, by 2050, a large proportion of these areas will be underwater. We're already seeing it happen in some suburbs. There's a suburb called Stockton, which is already getting washed away. It's just being washed away because of rising sea levels, but people deny it. And so they've called it a natural disaster. Even though I used it in the book, I was almost compelled by Routledge to use it. I don't believe in natural disasters. They're all caused by human agency. Particularly, as you can see, there are many of them related to climate change. Earthquakes is because you live in substandard buildings, you die. So you start looking at that, and it's this fatalistic notion. It's a God-given thing. It's an act of nature. It's natural, but that's totally wrong. What is happening is that we are altering the planet in such a way, and our ways of living in such a way that we're putting ourselves at risk. Look at this fantastic city, the Gold Coast. You said, Doug, you've been to Australia. You must have been to the Gold Coast. Such a top-end property right on the beach, maybe not even 15, 20 meters away. What's going to happen? Those areas are going to go underwater. No one is thinking of retreat. You start talking about that, it's impossible. And I see right here in Newcastle, new estates are coming up right on the coast. And I'm sure Miami won't be an exception.
I lived in Brisbane for 3.5 years, so I went down the Gold Coast quite a bit. And, there's just too much money to be made. It's all that expensive condominiums and people are living there. And you're absolutely right. Okay, I think we need to wrap this up. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I do want to get one more question in from the chat room. And the question is from Sarah. And what would you say are the key elements of effective reconstruction?
Okay. I think I gave you a slide. May I look at that? Am I allowed?
To look at
the slide I gave you. I just want to go through those points. I think I've given you a list.
Do you have the slide just in front of you? I mean, we have it just cycling through on our screen, so you don't really stop it. But if you just want to bring it up on your computer, that's fine.
Yeah.
Don't.
Okay. So I've got it in front. I'll just go through those points very quickly. Key elements of effective reconstruction. One is housing and infrastructure. They have to be linked. And I mentioned to you before that the successful project that we studied in our book, this is exactly what they did. Community infrastructure is not only roads and drainage and stuff, but also like in New Orleans, for example, they built a music center where the jazz musicians were largely housed in that area. They could develop the skills and stuff. So that's one side. It's a very quick one. Support for livelihood, local economy. I've given you the example of the Bangladesh project where they had a cash forward program where if you don't have money in your pocket, doesn't mean you're happy with just a home. You need to get back to your routine. So that's the other one. Sustained engagement, and very often these are fly-in, fly-out agencies. The large bulk of them, this is how they engage. They go build stuff, but then there are some agencies who continue because long-term housing is a protracted process. Recovery is a protracted process. It just takes a long, long time, and people need that kind of engagement and support for a sustained period. So that's the other one. Multi-stakeholder, all kinds of people need to be engaged. It's not someone's business. It's just not Red Cross going and doing it. Red Cross has to engage with the local government, local professionals, and so on. And then contribution of built environment professionals, which are often left out, architects, engineers. I've seen projects which are done by bankers And others who think that they know how a home should be built, they think it's not rocket science. But of course, the social, political aspects of it make it so nuanced that people need to engage professionals. And then also strategies for implementing in difficult contexts. We've talked about Haiti, that was a very difficult context, and also in very remote areas, which are often in marginal areas near the coast. What do you do? How do you actually build in these areas? How do you deploy materials and as well as expertise? So people who manage to have strategies for that are more successful. So
Okay, well, we covered a lot of ground today. I appreciate having this conversation with you. Really important work, and I thought I had a general idea of how some of this worked, but it just gets so complicated so fast. And yeah, it sounds like there's so many opportunities, I guess, to make it more efficient and getting help out to people. And yeah, definitely appreciate what you're doing.
thank you very much. It's a lifetime of research, I think. It'll keep going. Just to tell you, Doug, before we go, I'm trying to get in a research proposal to look at the recovery in Japan and Australia and to compare these two countries to learn from each other. Let's see how
Okay.
that goes. So it's a very different set of challenges and lessons.
Okay, so we're going to sign off now. I want you to stay on for just a few minutes. We're going to go into this kind of casual, just chatting scene, but just hang on for just a minute or two, and I'll get right back to you.